The Crooked Man story from Sherlock Holmes.
It had been a few months since I had married. One summer night, after an exhausting day, I was reading my novel while finishing my last pipe. I was so tired that my head kept nodding off. My wife had already gone upstairs to sleep. The sound of the living room door being locked indicated that the servants had also retired to their rooms. I had just risen to empty my pipe when I suddenly heard the bell ring. I looked at the clock. It was 11:45. There was no way a guest would come at this hour. It must certainly be a patient. I began to think that I would be sleepless again that night. With a grimace, I crossed the sitting room and opened the door, and was quite astonished. The person standing before me was Sherlock Holmes. "Good evening, Watson," he said. "I see, as I expected, that you are not yet in bed. Please come in, my dear fellow. You look surprised, but I can see that my presence relieves you. You are still smoking the Arcadia blend you used when you were single. I can tell from the feathery ash on your coat. You have clearly been accustomed to wearing a uniform, Watson. As long as you carry your handkerchief in your sleeve, you'll never be a true civilian, my friend. May I be your guest tonight? With pleasure. You once told me that you had a spare bed for bachelor friends, and for what I see, you have no other guest. Your coat rack tells me so. I would be honored to host you tonight. Thank you. Then let my hat fill the empty space on the rack. I see that an English workman has been here. That is not a good sign. I hope he was not a plumber. No, a gas fitter. His boot marks are still visible on the floor, right where the light falls. Thank you. I dined at Waterloo, but we might have a pipe together. I handed my tobacco pouch to Sherlock Holmes. Sitting opposite me, he smoked silently for a while. Since he had come at such an hour, he must have had important business, but he said nothing. I patiently waited for him to introduce the matter. Fixing his sharp gaze upon me, he said, "I see you have been very busy." "Yes, it has been a tiring day," I replied, adding, "You may think me foolish, but I cannot understand how you deduced that." Holmes smiled to himself. "It was not difficult. Knowing your habits," he said. "If you have few places to go, you walk. If the distance is long, you take a cab. Your boots are not muddy, so I concluded that you had traveled a distance long enough to require a carriage." "Excellent," I exclaimed. "It is quite simple," he said. "The conclusions reached by someone who knows how to reason may seem astonishing to others, but in reality, it is merely a matter of observing what others have overlooked. The same can be said of your writings, my dear fellow. When you omit certain details while recording our cases, my adventures appear far more fascinating than they actually are. At this moment, I am in the position of your readers. Although I possess a great deal of information about an extremely complex case, there are one or two points missing for me to complete my theory. But I shall find them. Watson, I shall certainly find them." His eyes suddenly sparkled, and his cheeks flushed. However, this did not last long. Soon, his face resumed that familiar expression which resembled that of a Red Indian. In this state, he seemed more like a machine than a man. "The case has its interesting aspects," he said. "Indeed, I might even call it extremely interesting. I have examined the matter, and I can say that the solution is in sight. I should be glad if you would accompany me in the final stage." "I shall come with pleasure. Can we go to Aldershot together tomorrow? Jackson will take my place." "Very good. We shall take the train from Waterloo at 11:10. We have plenty of time. If you're not too sleepy, I can tell you what has happened and what we must do. I was sleepy before you came, but now I am quite awake. I shall try to summarize it without omitting any important points. You may have read something about this case. I am investigating the death of Colonel Barclay, commander of the Royal Munster Regiment stationed at Aldershot. I had heard nothing of it. The matter is quite recent, only 2 days old. It is natural that it has not attracted much attention here. Let me summarize. As you know, the Munster Regiment is one of the most distinguished Irish regiments in the British Army. It distinguished itself in the Crimean War and in the Mutiny. Since then, it has successfully carried out every assignment given to it. Until Monday night, the regiment was commanded by a senior soldier named James Barclay. Although he had joined the regiment as a private, his bravery during the suppression of the mutiny earned him promotion to officer, and eventually he rose to command the very regiment in which he had once served as a private. Colonel Barclay married Nancy Devoy, the daughter of Mr. Devoy, who had been a color sergeant in the same regiment when Barclay himself was a sergeant. As one might expect, the young couple initially experienced some difficulties in adapting to their new social circle, but they soon overcame them. Mrs. Barclay got along well with the other officers' wives, and her husband was also well liked among the soldiers. I should add that the lady is remarkably beautiful. Although they have been married for over 30 years, she still looks like a queen. Colonel Barclay and his wife appeared to lead a very happy life. Major Murphy, who has told me most of what I know, says that he has never witnessed the slightest disagreement between them. The colonel would become restless if separated from his wife, even for a single day. The lady, though devoted to her husband, was not quite as dependent as he was. Nevertheless, this middle-aged couple was considered exemplary within the regiment. Those who knew them could never have anticipated such a tragedy. Colonel Barclay did have certain peculiar traits. Although generally known as a cheerful and sociable man, he could at times display a vindictive and harsh nature, though never toward his wife. Of the 5 officers I spoke to, 3 mentioned that he would occasionally fall into strange fits of depression. At times when everyone else was cheerful, his smile would suddenly vanish, as if wiped away by an invisible hand. Once in that state, he would remain gloomy for days. The house stood on its own grounds, about 25 meters from the main road to the west. There were only 3 servants in the house, a coachman and 2 maids. As they had no children, only 5 people lived in the villa. They rarely had overnight guests. Now we come to the events that occurred between 9 and 10 o'clock on Monday evening. Mrs. Barclay is a Catholic. She is among the founders of the St. George Society, connected to Watt Street Church, which collects old clothing to distribute to the poor. That evening, there was a meeting at 8 o'clock, and she left early after dinner in order to attend. Before leaving, she instructed the coachman to tell her husband not to worry and that she would not be late. She then went to the meeting with Mrs. Morrison, who lived in a neighboring villa. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. At 9:15, Mrs. Barclay parted from Mrs. Morrison at the latter's door and returned home. There is a room in the villa used as a sitting room during the day. It faces the road and opens onto the garden through a large folding glass door. A low garden wall, topped with iron railings, separates the house from the road at a distance of 25 meters. Upon returning home, Mrs. Barclay entered this room. Since it was rarely used in the evenings, the curtains were not drawn. After entering, she lit the lamp and rang the bell for the maid, Jane Stewart, requesting a cup of tea, something quite unusual for her. At that moment, the colonel, who was in the dining room, heard that his wife had returned and went into the sitting room. The coachman saw him enter. No one saw him alive again. The maid brought the tea 10 minutes later. As she approached the door, she was startled to hear voices inside. Husband and wife were arguing loudly. She knocked, but received no answer. She tried the handle, but the door was locked from the inside. Naturally, she ran to the cook and told her what was happening. The 2 women returned with the coachman, and the argument was still continuing. All 3 agreed that only 2 voices, that of the Barclays, could be heard inside. The man spoke calmly and briefly, so they could not make out his words. The woman, however, was extremely agitated and shouting loudly. She repeatedly cried, "You coward! And what can we do now? What do we do now? Give me back my life. I will not breathe the same air as you. You coward! You coward!" These are the words the servants could hear. At last, they heard a dreadful cry from the man, followed by a heavy thud, and then a piercing scream from the woman. Realizing that something terrible had happened, the coachman tried to force the door but failed. Meanwhile, the screams from inside did not cease. The two maids were so frightened that they were unable to assist him. Suddenly, an idea struck the coachman. He ran outside, went around through the garden, and entered through the window. As it was summer and the weather warm, one of the French windows had been left open, making entry easy. When he entered, the woman had stopped screaming. She lay unconscious on a chair. The colonel lay dead on the floor, his feet hanging over the edge of a chair, his head near the fireplace fender, in a pool of his own blood. The coachman immediately attempted to open the door to call for help, but this proved impossible. The key was not in the lock. He searched the room, but could not find it. He then went out through the window and returned with a policeman and a doctor. Mrs. Barclay, the chief suspect in the murder, had still not regained consciousness. They removed the woman from the room, placed the colonel's body on a sofa, and carefully examined the scene. The fatal wound was at the back of the man's head. A rough wound about 5 centimeters long, evidently caused by a heavy blow from a blunt object. The murder weapon was easily found. Near the body lay a strange club made of hard wood with a bone handle. Since the colonel had a large collection of weapons from the countries in which he had served, it was assumed that this club was one of them. The servants claimed never to have seen it before, but in a house filled with many curious objects, it was quite possible it had escaped their notice. The police found nothing else of significance in the room. However, one curious fact remained. Despite searching the entire room and the persons of both Mr. and Mrs. Barclay, the missing key could not be found. The door was eventually opened by a locksmith from Aldershot. When I went to Aldershot on Tuesday morning, at Major Murphy's request to assist the police, that was the situation, Watson. I am sure you find it highly interesting, but from my observations, I realized that the case was far more complex than I had anticipated. Before examining the room, I cross-examined the servants, but they told me nothing beyond what I already knew. Only one detail, remembered by the maid Jane Stewart, was somewhat interesting. You will recall that when she first heard the argument, she was alone at the door. She said that although the couple were arguing, they were not speaking very loudly at first. She could not make out the words, but concluded from their tones that they were quarreling. When I pressed her to recall more, she said that she heard the woman mention the name David twice. This may provide a clue to the cause of the quarrel, for as you know, the colonel's name was James. There is another point that deeply impressed both the police and the servants, Holmes continued. That is the expression on the colonel's face. According to them, it was as though he had been struck by terror. So dreadful was his expression that those who saw it fainted. It appears that he faced death in utter horror. This supports the police theory. If he saw his wife attacking him, his face might well have assumed such an expression of fear. The fact that the blow was struck from behind does not invalidate this theory, for he may have turned to flee. It is impossible to obtain any information from Mrs. Barclay, as she has not yet recovered from brain fever. According to the police, Mrs. Morrison, who had been with Mrs. Barclay that evening, stated that she had no idea why her friend was in such low spirits when she returned home. After putting all these facts together, I smoked pipe after pipe while pondering the case. I tried to distinguish the important points from the unimportant ones. I can say that the most important point in this case is the disappearance of the door key. Since the police searched the room from top to bottom and still could not find the key, then the key was not in the room. We also know that it was not on the colonel or on his wife. In that case, it is certain that there was a third person in the room. The only possible way that this third person could have entered was through the window. I thought that if I examined the room and the garden carefully, I might find traces of this mysterious individual. You know my methods, Watson. I used them in an attempt to discover something. There really had been a third person in the room, and he had come from the road, crossed the garden from end to end, and entered through the window. I was able to identify 5 very distinct footprints. One was at the roadside, where he had climbed the low wall. 2 were on the grass, and 2 more, faintly visible, were on the stained paving stones beside the window. It was obvious that he had come running toward the house, because the toes of the prints were much more deeply impressed than the heels. But what truly surprised me was not the man, but his companion. His companion? Holmes carefully unfolded a sheet of paper from his pocket and spread it out on his knee. "What do you make of this?" he asked. The paper was covered with the footprints of a small animal. There were 5 in all. It appeared to have long claws on its feet. Each print was about the size of a dessert spoon. "It must be a dog," I said. "Have you ever seen a dog climb a curtain?" This creature left its footprints on the curtain. Then perhaps it was a monkey? The prints do not match those of a monkey. Then what was it? It was not a dog, a cat, or any other familiar animal. I tried to estimate its size. Here are the marks the animal left while standing motionless on all 4s. You can see that the distance between the front and hind feet is a little less than 40 centimeters. Taking into account the neck and head as well, we may conclude that it was at least 60 centimeters long, excluding the tail. Now, let us look at the other marks. Since the animal moved about the room, we can also judge the length of its stride. The space between the prints is only 7.5 centimeters. It is therefore clearly an animal with a long body and short legs. Though I could not determine its color, since it was not considerate enough to leave any hair behind in the room, I was able to understand its general appearance. I know that it is a carnivorous animal capable of climbing curtains. How did you know it was carnivorous? From its having climbed the curtain. There was a canary in a cage beside the window, so the animal had evidently wanted to get at it. And what species was this animal? If I knew that, I would have made serious progress in the investigation. I think it must belong to the weasel family, but it is larger than any weasel we know. And what has this animal to do with the crime? That is not yet clear, but as you see, I have already made considerable progress. We know that the man stood by the roadside and witnessed the quarrel between the Barclays, for the curtains in the room were undrawn and the lamp was lit. We also know that he leaped over the wall and entered through the window with the strange animal at his side. We know that either the man struck the colonel, or the colonel, upon seeing him, fell in fright and may have died by striking his head against the fender. Finally, we know that this uninvited visitor left the room, taking the key with him. "What you have learned has made the case even more complicated," I said. "You are right. All this shows that the case is far more complex than had been supposed. I considered the matter from every angle and decided that I would have to approach it from a different perspective. But I do not wish to keep you up any longer, Watson. I can tell you the rest on our way to Aldershot tomorrow." "Thank you, but since you have begun, I think you ought to finish." When Mrs. Barclay left home at 7:30, there was nothing wrong between her and her husband. I believe I told you that she was not excessively devoted to him, but according to the coachman, they spoke quite pleasantly to one another when they parted. We also know that as soon as she returned home, she went to the room where she was least likely to see her husband, and, like nervous women do, immediately asked for tea. When her husband entered, a violent quarrel began between them. In that case, We may say that something occurred between 7:30 and 9 o'clock that completely changed the woman's attitude toward her husband. During that entire time, Mrs. Morrison never once left Mrs. Barkley's side. Though she denies it, it is perfectly clear that she knows something. At first, I thought there had been some matter involving this young lady and the senior soldier, and that Mrs. Morrison had confessed it to Mrs. Barkley. Although Mrs. Morrison would not admit it, such an incident might explain why Mrs. Barkley was agitated when she returned home. Moreover, it did not greatly conflict with the conversation the maid had overheard. However, Mrs. Barkley had uttered the name David, and despite Mr. Barkley's obsessive devotion to his wife, his failure to object when another man was mentioned might have been unrelated to all that had occurred. Following a trail is not an easy business, but I was not of the opinion that there was anything between the Colonel and Mrs. Morrison. Even so, I was certain that this woman knew something about why Mrs. Barkley had suddenly come to hate her husband. In that case, the proper course was obvious. I would go to Mrs. Morrison and tell her that I knew she was withholding information from the police, and that unless she spoke, her friend Mrs. Barkley might be hanged. Mrs. Morrison is a fair-haired little thing, shy-eyed and not much inclined toward worldly affairs, but she is certainly intelligent and possessed of good sense. After listening to me, she remained silent for a while, thinking, and then turned to me resolutely and said the following words, which I shall now summarize for you. My friend made me promise that I would speak of this matter to no one, and I must keep my word. But since my friend now stands accused of so grave a crime, and is too ill to defend herself against the charges, I think there can be no harm in breaking my promise. I will tell you exactly what happened to us on Monday evening. It was about 8:45 when, on our way back from the society meeting, we had to pass through Hudson Street, which is quite deserted. There was only one lamp in the street, and it stood on the left-hand side of the road. As we approached the lamp, I noticed a man walking toward us, bent nearly double, carrying a small box on his shoulder. The man appeared to be crippled. His back was bent, his neck thrust forward, and his knees were crooked. We came abreast of him by the lamp. As he passed us, he raised his head and looked at our faces. At once he stopped short, gave a dreadful cry, and shouted, "My God, it's Nancy!" Mrs. Barkley turned white as death, and would have fallen had that dreadful-looking creature not caught hold of her. My first thought was to call for the police, but I was so astonished to see Mrs. Barkley speaking to the man in quite a gentle manner that I gave up the idea. In a trembling voice, she said, "I thought you had been dead for 30 years, Henry." The man replied, "I am dead already." His voice was full of sorrow. He had a most dreadful face. The strange gleam in his eye still haunts my dreams. His hair and beard were gray. His face looked like a withered apple. Mrs. Barkley said to me, "Go on a little way, dear. I wish to speak with this man for a moment. Do not be afraid. There is nothing to fear." She was trying to reassure me by her words, but her face was still white as chalk, and the words came with difficulty from between her trembling lips. I did as she asked. The two of them spoke for a minute or two. When Mrs. Barkley came back to me, I saw that her eyes were blazing with anger. The crippled man remained standing by the lamp, holding his fist in the air. I concluded that he too was in a great rage. Mrs. Barkley did not say a single word until we reached our front door. When we arrived there, she took my hand and begged me not to tell anyone what had happened. Then she said, "That man has been cruelly treated by fate. He was an old acquaintance of mine." I promised that I would say nothing, and Mrs. Barkley kissed me and left me. I did not see her again after that hour. There, I have told you everything exactly as it happened. If I withheld anything from the police, it was only because I did not then understand the danger my friend was in. Now, however, I realize that it is in her best interest for everything to come to light. That was the substance of the woman's statement, Watson. As you may imagine, her words were like a light shining in the darkness for me. Bridges began to form between things that had previously seemed unrelated. Certain conjectures began to arise in my mind regarding everything that had happened. My next step, of course, was to find a man who had so deeply affected Mrs. Barkley. If he was still in Aldershot, that would not be difficult, for it is a small place and there are not many civilians about. Besides, his appearance is striking in the extreme. After searching all day, I found him this evening, this very evening. His name is Henry Wood, and he lodges at the boarding house on the very street where he encountered the ladies. He had taken up residence there 5 days ago. Disguised as a census official, I managed to learn some interesting things about him from the woman who keeps the house. The man is a conjurer who entertains the soldiers by performing in the barracks at night. The animal he carries about with him in a cage greatly frightened the poor woman, for it was unlike any creature she had ever seen. According to her, he uses it in his act. That was all the woman told me. She was also astonished that a man so twisted in every limb could still be alive. During the last 2 nights, she had heard him speaking in some strange language in his room, weeping and groaning. He paid his rent, but the money he had given as a deposit was peculiar. The woman said it resembled a counterfeit florin. She showed it to me. It was an Indian rupee. And now I shall explain my theory of the case and why I need your assistance, Watson. It is perfectly clear that after parting from the ladies, the man followed them from a distance and saw the quarrel between husband and wife through the window. He then rushed in, and at that moment the animal from the cage escaped. So much we know. But the only person who can tell us exactly what happened in that room is this man. And you want to speak to him and ask what happened, do you not? Certainly, but with a witness present. I suppose that witness is to be me. I am afraid I must trouble you to serve in that capacity. If the man tells us what occurred, so much the better. If not, we have no alternative but to have him arrested. How do you know he will be at the boarding house when we get there? Do not worry about that. I have taken certain precautions. I sent one of the Baker Street boys to keep watch. If the man attempts to go anywhere, the boy will stick to him like a tail. When we go to Hudson Street tomorrow, the man will be there, Watson. But if I keep you from your sleep any longer, I shall be committing the greater crime. By the time we arrived in Aldershot, it was noon. Guided by Sherlock Holmes, we were making our way toward Hudson Street. Despite my friend's skill in concealing his emotions, I could tell how excited he was. As for me, I felt a pleasant thrill of curiosity and anticipation as I reflected on the cases I had followed with both fascination and the delight of learning. As we entered the street lined on both sides with plain 2-story brick buildings, he said, "Here we are. Simpson is just coming to report." A street boy running toward us shouted, "The man's still inside, Mr. Holmes." Holmes patted the boy on the head. "Well done, Simpson," he said. "Come, Watson. Is this building here?" He sent in his card with a message that he had come on important business. A moment later, we found ourselves face to face with the man we wished to see. Although the weather was warm, the man was crouching by the fireplace, and the room was like an oven. He was drawn up in his chair in such a strange fashion that even had he not risen, one could still have seen that he was crippled. The dark, weary face he turned toward us must once have been remarkably handsome. Without rising and without uttering a single word, he surveyed us with those suspicious eyes and then gestured toward the chairs with his hand. With the utmost cordiality, Holmes said, "I believe I have the honor of making the acquaintance of Mr. Henry Wood, lately arrived from India. I have come here in connection with the death of Colonel Barkley. What has it got to do with me? That is precisely what I have come to determine. I assume you are aware that unless this matter is clarified, Your old friend, Mrs. Barkley, will be tried for murder." The man sprang to his feet at once. "I do not know you, nor do I know how you learned that. But do you swear that what you say is true?" he cried. "Certainly. They are waiting for her to recover consciousness before arresting her." "My God, are you a policeman?" "No." "Then why does this matter concern you?" "The cause of justice concerns every man. I assure you, she is innocent." "Then you killed him." "No, I did not kill him." "Then who killed Colonel James Barkley?" "One might call it an act of fate, but let me tell you this. Even if I had beaten his brains out with my own hands, it would still not have repaid what he did to me. If he had not died of remorse, I would certainly have stained my hand with his filthy blood. So you want me to tell you everything, do you? Very well, I shall do as you ask. I have nothing to fear. Do not judge me by this camel-like hunch, sir, nor by my twisted ribs. Corporal Henry Wood was once the handsomest man in the 117th Regiment. At that time, we were in a district of India called Bertie. Barkley, the man who died the other day, was in the same regiment. Nancy Devoy, the daughter of the color sergeant of our company, and the loveliest girl I ever laid eyes on, had two men in love with her, but she loved only one of them. You may laugh if I tell you that the misshapen creature now crouching before the fire was the man who won Nancy's heart. But that was the truth. Though Nancy loved me, her father wanted her to marry Barkley. I was a reckless young fellow who feared nothing. But Barkley was educated, and it was plain that he would be promoted to officer. Yet Nancy stood firm for me, and it seemed that sooner or later we were bound to be married. When a mutiny broke out, the gates of hell were thrown wide open. Our regiment, together with half a battery of artillery, a C company, a number of civilians, and several women, was trapped. 10,000 rebels surrounded us, ready to attack at any moment like mad dogs. By the second week, our water had run out, and it was uncertain whether we could establish contact with the column advancing under General Neal. But since it was impossible to break through the siege with so many women and children beside us, our only chance was to reach General Neal and ask for help. I volunteered for the dangerous task. Sergeant Barkley knew the terrain better than anyone, so I consulted him about the route I should follow. He marked out for me what he said was the safest path through the rebels. That night, I set out at 10 o'clock. When I left the fort, I left behind 1,000 souls in need of saving. But only one of them occupied my thoughts. I was to follow a dry riverbed. In that way, I would avoid the enemy's sentries. But when I crawled round a bend and rose to my feet, I fell straight into the hands of 6 men who had been lying in wait for me. Before I knew what had happened, I was struck on the head and collapsed. When I came to, my hands and feet were bound. But the real blow had not fallen upon my head. It had struck my heart. For from what I heard the men saying, I understood that the one who had betrayed me to the enemy was none other than the very friend who had planned my route. Through one of his native servants, he had informed the rebels of the path I would take. There is no need to go into those details at length. That is the sort of scoundrel your James Barkley was. The next day, General Neal relieved Bertie, but the rebels took me with them when they retreated, and for years I lived without seeing a single white face. I was tortured. I tried to escape, but they caught me and tortured me again. You can see for yourself what became of me. Some of the rebels fled to Nepal and took me with them, and from there we passed into Darjeeling. When the hill tribes there killed the rebels, I became their slave instead. At last I managed to escape, but I had to go north rather than south. In the end, I reached Afghanistan. After wandering there for years, I returned to the Punjab and lived among the natives. I earned my living by performing tricks I had learned. The thought of returning to England and rejoining my old comrades never once crossed my mind. Even the desire for revenge could not persuade me to come back. I would rather Nancy and my old companions believe Harry was dead than see him hobbling with a stick bent double like a chimpanzee. They were certain that I was dead, and that was exactly what I wanted. I had heard that Barclay had married Nancy and was rising rapidly in the regiment, but even that had not changed my mind. But as a man grows older, he begins to long for his homeland. For years, I had dreamed of England's green fields and hedgerows. At last, I decided to see my country again before I died. I saved enough money for the journey home, and then I came here. I chose this place because there were so many soldiers. After all, I knew soldiers' ways well enough, and I knew how to amuse them. Your story is exceedingly interesting, said Sherlock Holmes. I'd already heard that you met Mrs. Barclay after coming here, and that you recognized one another. As I understand it, you followed Mrs. Barclay home and witnessed her quarrel with her husband through the window. You were certain that the subject of the quarrel was yourself. Unable to control yourself, you leaped over the wall and ran in through the window. That is exactly how it happened, sir. When Barclay saw me, he was so overcome with terror that I do not think I have ever seen such a face in my life. He fell headlong against the fireplace bars, but the man was dead before he even hit the ground. Just as I can read writing clearly in the light of this fire, so I read death upon his face. The moment he saw me, his sense of guilt struck his heart like a bullet, and then Nancy fainted. I took the key from her hand, intending to open the door and call for help, but afterward I changed my mind. The whole situation was entirely against me. If anyone were to see me, I would be accused of murder and my secret would be exposed as well. I thrust the key hurriedly into my pocket and caught Teddy, who had climbed the curtain, and put him back in his cage. But while I was dealing with Teddy, I dropped my stick. In all that confusion, I left the stick where it had fallen, slung the cage over my shoulder, and fled as fast as I could. "And who is Teddy?" Holmes asked. The man bent down and opened the door of the cage that stood in the corner. At once, a beautiful reddish-brown creature slipped out with a slender, agile body. Its feet were like those of a weasel, and its nose was long and narrow. Never had I seen such beautiful red eyes in any animal. "A mongoose," I cried. "Some call it that," said the man. "I call these creatures snake hunters. Teddy never gives a cobra any quarter. I have one cobra with its fangs removed. Every night, Teddy catches it and entertains the soldiers. Is there anything else you wish to ask, sir?" "For the present, no. But if Mrs. Barclay should find herself in serious trouble, we may appeal to you again. In that case, I shall help gladly. Although Mr. Barclay did you a great wrong, I do not think there is any point in exposing the sins of a dead man. I suppose it is enough satisfaction for you to know that his conscience gave him no peace for 30 years. Therefore, unless we are compelled to do so, let us not reveal the truth. Ah, there is Major Murphy walking on the other side of the road. Good day to you, Mr. Wood. I shall go and see whether there has been any development since yesterday." We caught up with the Major before we reached the corner. "Hello, Holmes," he said. "You have heard, I suppose, that all this fuss has come to nothing? What is the truth of the matter, then?" "The inquiry is closed. According to the coroner's report, the cause of death was sudden apoplexy. So you see, in fact, the whole matter was extremely simple." Holmes smiled. "Indeed, it was extremely simple," he said. "Come, Watson. There is no further need for us in Aldershot." As we walked toward the station, I said, "There is one thing that still puzzles me. The woman's husband's name was James, and the other man's was Henry. Then who was David? If I had truly been as perfect a reasoner as you make me out to be, I ought to have solved the whole case from that single word. It is perfectly clear that she used it as an insult. An insult. Yes, an insult. David, too, at times went astray, And on one occasion, he did what Sergeant James Barkley had done. You know what happened to Uriah and Bathsheba? I fear my knowledge of Holy Scripture is a little rusty, but I think the story appears in the first or second book of Samuel.